Zelikovitz Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to acknowledge that those of us who are here in Ottawa are on unceded Indigenous lands, and we are grateful to their stewardship for these lands. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have author Emanuel Rosen speak with us, and I'd like to say a few words to introduce him. Emanuel Rosen is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 13 languages. He was born in Israel, where he went to school, served in the army, and was an award-winning copywriter. After his graduate school education in the United States and a successful career as an executive in Silicon Valley, Emmanuel turned to writing. His first book, The Anatomy of Buzz, Doubleday 2000, was a national bestseller. And his third book, Absolute Value, with Stanford professor Itamar Simonson, won the 2016 American Marketing Association Best Book Award. Emmanuel was previously vice president marketing at Nile Software, where he launched the company's flagship product, EndNote. Rosen has presented his work in many forums around the world, including at companies such as Google, Intel, and Nike. His work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Time, Advertising Age, and other publications. If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died is his fourth book, and a very different theme and topic than a lot of your other work. So tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome Emanuel Rosen to speak. He'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. It'll be my pleasure to moderate our conversation after. We're a nice small group, so we should have some good conversation together. Thank you, Emanuel Rosen, for joining us tonight, and to everyone for coming out on a beautiful spring evening to have some thoughtful speech. To you.
Thank you, Deidre, so much. Thank you for organizing this event, and thank you indeed to everyone who's listening. I'm going to talk about my book, If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died. This may sound a little terrible, but in fact, this is something that my mom used to say every day before her nap time. She used to say, if anyone called, tell them I died, which was kind of her regular one-liner. She had several of those. I guess that was her way of coping. And let me give you a quick overview and some background about the book. In 1933, my grandfather, Dr. Hugo Mendel, was a lawyer in Germany, a respected, successful lawyer. And once Hitler took power, my grandfather got a letter that he could no longer appear in court or practice law in Germany because he was Jewish. My grandmother and him decided to move to Tel Aviv, and they immigrated with my mother, Miriam, and my uncle, Rafi. They settled in Tel Aviv. 23 years after that, that is in 1956, my grandparents, only without the children, went back to Germany for a couple of months. And upon their return, about 5 months later, my grandfather committed suicide. He jumped to his death. Now, as a kid, I didn't know any of this. I knew that my grandfather died, but I had no idea about the suicide. I had a very good childhood in Tel Aviv. I was raised by a single mother, my mother, and with the help of my grandmother. My father died when I was very young, just 8 months old. And then after my mother died, I found a box with letters. Actually, I have this box right now, right here. The letters are no longer here because they're all filed after I translated them, but this box of letters got me curious, and I realized that these are actually the letters that my grandparents had sent my mom from that 1956 trip. And I said, okay, maybe these letters would explain to me what happened. I had someone translate them to me. I was left with more questions than answers. And then I decided to go to Germany, because one thing that I had in these letters were details about exactly where they went, where they ate, where they slept, etc. So I recreated their journey, slept in the same hotel, took the same trains, sat at the same cafes. And then in the city of Hamm, Westphalia, this is where my grandfather practiced law until 1933, I was handed a folder that opened my eyes to a different part of the story. It turned out that a few years after the suicide, my grandmother, with the help of my mother was really the engine behind it, sued the German authorities to prove that those who expelled Hugo Mendel from his profession, from his cultural environment, were responsible for his death. So my book is my trip following my grandparents' trip and about this lawsuit that lasted more than 7 years. Now, this is one family story, but obviously it has some broader implications. It shows that even people who left Europe early, they were the lucky ones, and they were lucky. Even for them, there were Nazi persecution left serious traumas and sometimes death. And it also, and that's something I'll talk about, makes us think about how different people deal with displacement and uprooting. Let me now share the screen so I can show you some of the characters involved. So these are the three main characters, Hugo and Lucy Mendel and their daughter. And here is in 1925, she's 3 years old. And now when I say that these are the three main characters, I think that really the two main characters are my mom and my grandmother, because I don't know too much about Hugo. He died when I was about 4 years old. And I knew very well my grandmother and my mother, and he didn't leave behind too much. So the main two characters are these two ladies that you'll see in a second in the picture here on the beach in Germany. I think you can get a lot from this picture in terms of their lifestyle. Obviously, they were not religious. They were, Jewish. They went to the synagogue twice a year. Upper middle class, and they had a good time. This letter, which you don't need to read, I'm just showing it there, it's in German, was a dramatic turnaround. This is the letter that tells my grandfather that he can no longer appear in court because he does not belong to the Aryan race. It was sent from the president of the Oberlandesgericht, which was the higher regional court in that city of Hamm. Now, this was obviously a big shock. There were some back and forth about what to do, but my grandparents decided to leave to Palestine. My grandfather decided he didn't want to be a lawyer in Palestine, and I'll explain later why. And he went to the south of Germany to buy some machinery for a mesh fencing, a wire fence company. While he was in South Germany getting the equipment, my grandmother and the kids went to Switzerland to a very nice resort there. So the whole thing, you're not talking about refugees who were running away at night, but on the contrary, they positioned it as a luxurious vacation even. Here, there is another picture of them they went to Rome, they went to Athens. Here they're in Athens at some archaeological site. So again, they tried to frame everything as a good thing. Obviously, you can tell by their faces that maybe it wasn't such an easy thing, not such a good thing. This is another picture from 1934. This is a typical picture of Europeans just getting used to the Israeli sun, for those who visited Israel. I love this picture. And this is next to this factory that my grandfather, Hugo Mendel, started. Now, unfortunately, he did not adjust to the business climate and to the language. He didn't speak English, he didn't speak Hebrew. So very quickly, the business failed. Now, you may ask a question, why didn't he continue to be a lawyer in Palestine? Well, in order to practice law in Palestine at the time, you had to go through a special exam to show that you're familiar with the British law. This Palestine was under the British mandate. And he didn't speak any English, as I said. He was 42 years old. And he felt that he did not want to take that route, which later on he'll meet people who did, that made it very difficult for him. The business failed. My grandmother also started a business, a cafe in Tel Aviv. You can see her on the left in 1934, and she's with my mom and her brother. My mom was 11 years old in 1933. Her brother was 7 years old. And you see there is still optimism. On the right-hand side, this is a picture from 37, I think, and they're older. They became Israelis, especially my mom's brother, Rafi, who really integrated very well. My mom was an Israeli too, but Rafi especially. And this is a picture of him from 1955, I think, like 30 years later. And we'll meet him down the road later. He became involved with Secret Service of Israel, and he was actually a Mossad agent. And after he died a few years ago, I found out that he was a head of one of the Mossad units to hunt down Nazi criminals in Germany or in Europe in general. So we'll come back to that. But he was totally an Israeli, and he has an interesting story to tell. Now, families usually take pictures when things are good. And so we don't have too many pictures from the 40s or 50s. This is a picture of them in a smaller apartment that they moved to after they lost the business, after the cafe closed. By now, my grandmother was working as a waitress. My grandfather was working as a salesman for the same company that he actually started. So you can get an idea about their loss of status. And they did not speak Hebrew. They did not speak English. They lived in a small community of what was known as Yekes, people from Germany, Jews from Germany who lived in Tel Aviv, they lived in Haifa, in Jerusalem. There were small communities, and you could manage pretty well without Hebrew there. So they spoke only German. I want to read you a little thing from the book where I talk about this, so you understand the mentality of my grandparents. Some Yekes, so Yekes are these German Jews or Jews from German-speaking countries. Some Yekes integrated well in Israel, learned Hebrew, and started successful businesses or thriving farms. Others did not, and at least part of the reason often related to their difficulty with the local language. My grandparents tried to learn Hebrew with very limited success. When they arrived at the port of Haifa in 1933, they were greeted by a cousin from Germany who had been in the country for 7 years already and spoke fluent Hebrew. And my grandmother said, "Oh, in 7 years, my Hebrew will be even better." And that's something we always made fun of her for the next 50 years, anytime she tried to speak Hebrew. She never spoke Hebrew. Something in the structure of this strange Semitic language was never welcomed in Lucy's and Hugo's European brain. So my mother, who was fluent in German, Hebrew, and English, served as a broker between her parents and the authorities. Her services as a translator were less needed on the street because many shopkeepers in Tel Aviv back then spoke Yiddish, which is related to German. So Lucy and Hugo, like many of their fellow Yekes, spoke German to people who would then respond in Yiddish. They managed, but they were not very happy. They managed, but they were not very happy. So the question is now, what made them in 1956 go to Germany. Why did they decide to go to Germany? And I don't have a definite answer. But certainly there are some assumptions. One thing that they do say in their letters, we came to Germany to rest from 23 years of hardship. So they really had a hard time in Palestine. And they had this idea that in Germany they can rest. Another possibility is they simply, they missed their homeland where they were born and they wanted to go back and see it. There is also a possibility that my grandfather wanted to become a lawyer again. He knew people who went back to Germany and worked as lawyers or worked as lawyers both in Tel Aviv and Germany. So maybe he had this idea. It's also possible that they wanted to move to Germany permanently. I don't think it's likely because we were in Israel, but it's a possibility. One thing is for sure, they could now afford it. That's important because in 1952, Israel and Germany signed a reparations agreement that allowed people to start getting restitution money from Germany. And my grandfather started to get a small amount every month for the loss of his profession. And that kind of allowed them, they were definitely not rich, but that allowed them to make this trip to Germany. They landed first in Munich, and they actually stayed at the airport there in a restricted area because they didn't have a visa yet to enter Germany. Israel and Germany did not have diplomatic relations yet. So they flew to Amsterdam, spent just a few hours at the airport in Munich, flew to Amsterdam, slept there in a hotel, and in the morning got a visa to go to Germany. And my grandmother would remember it in her letters as the best time they had this whole trip because Amsterdam was Europe, but without the emotional baggage that being in Germany was associated with. So the first place where they landed, and I landed too, was Düsseldorf. And I can tell you about my experience because it was only the second time I was in Germany. It was very strange, even surreal. I put my stuff in the hotel, went downstairs and started walking in the same street that they described in their letters. My grandfather was very detailed about everything except for about his emotions. And I walked on the same streets, turned the corner, looked at postcard that they sent and how it looks today. It was very interesting. And I heard German all around me, obviously, but I also heard a lot of German in my head because my grandma didn't speak Hebrew. She always talked to me in German, but not enough that I understand everything. But I have this rich vocabulary of words in German that I don't understand their meaning. It's very strange. It still happens to me to a lesser extent when I go to Germany. The other thing that was surreal, the whole time I'm walking on the streets and thinking about Hugo wrote this, because I'm there to understand why Hugo did it. And when I get back to the hotel, there was this shopping bag, empty shopping bag next to my door with the logo Hugo. I guess that's the branding for Hugo Boss there. And it was full with paper waste, essentially kind of symbolic to how much I know about Hugo and where I know it from. Now, there was a big difference between the letters from Lucy and the letters from Hugo. Sometimes I call her Lucy, sometimes Lucy, because we used to call her Oma, but my mom would, or people would refer to her as Lucy. My grandmother, Lucy, was not shy about showing her emotions. She was extremely angry. She was very bitter about the Germans, and she wasn't hiding it in the letters to my mom. In contrast, my grandfather was laconic. He just reported where they went, where they ate, slept, etc., with times of departures and arrival. But he was very, he did not share his emotions. They did not talk to anyone who was not Jewish or Israeli. By Israeli, they meant someone who spent some time in Tel Aviv. I was surprised by how many acquaintances, Jewish acquaintances they had already. This is 1956, about 10 years after the war. But they did not speak to other people unless, if it was a waiter, of course. And I think part of it came from fear. They knew that, the people around them, some of them were just 15 years earlier, were executing Jews full time. So I think that there was that. And they knew also that Nazis did not get serious sentences. In fact, like 5 minutes or 10 minutes from their hotel, there was a psychiatric clinic of Düsseldorf, and the head of this clinic was a psychiatrist who, during Nazi time, sent mentally ill people to their death as part of the notorious T4 program to improve, quote unquote, the Aryan race. So there were in this environment of people who they didn't know their past. Incidentally, keep that psychiatrist in mind because he's going to appear again in the story. But that was their experience in Düsseldorf. Why didn't they leave? They were unhappy in Düsseldorf. Their letters, they're very unhappy about Düsseldorf, what a city. They used to love Düsseldorf, and they keep talking about Wiesbaden. Wiesbaden is the place where they had the best vacation, like that first picture from 1925. But they're not leaving, and I was confused. Why aren't they leaving? And then some months later, I found in my house in California, two German passports. So it turned out that they actually applied for a German passport, and they got the passport about a week after they arrived in Düsseldorf. And once they had the passport, that's when they went to Wiesbaden. And this is their next stop. This is a picture from 1925. Sitting there is my grandma, next to her, my mom at age 3, and behind them, we called her Tante Lise. She was Hugo's sister, and she was really part of this core family. She was always with them and also taking care of my mom. And in fact, in their letters, you start to sense lightness. They are happier than they were in Düsseldorf. And I started here to understand what they meant by saying in their letters that they came to rest from 23 years of hardship. So here in Wiesbaden, you start to sense something else. One day they went to Frankfurt, which is right next to Wiesbaden. To those who are familiar with Germany, it's about, I think, an hour. And here they were invited for lunch with some other Jewish German lawyers. And I'm thinking, what's happening in my grandfather's mind when he sees that this was a host. His name was Ernst Katzenstein. At the time, he was the head of the claims conference in Germany. That's an agency that was negotiating the restitution and reparation agreement with the German government. And Ernst Katzenstein had a very similar story to my grandfather. He was also a Jewish lawyer. He fled to Palestine, but he did take the exam for foreign lawyers, and he became a successful lawyer in Jerusalem. So I'm just imagining this. My grandfather, again, didn't write that, but why didn't I take the exam? What if, etc. This is the way we assess our own situation. We often compare it with other people, and I suspect this was a cause of anxiety. At the same time, my grandfather Hugo also knew about other stories. This is another person, also a Jewish lawyer with a similar story to Hugo's, my grandfather's Hugo's. In fact, very similar. He was a lawyer also in the same city of Ham, Westphalia, and he also fled to Palestine. He did not take the exam, and he started his own business and failed too. and his name was Eric Samwelsdorf, Dr. Eric Samwelsdorf. And Samwelsdorf tried to go back to Germany and reestablish his business just 2 years before my grandfather and grandmother were there in 1954. And he rented a small room and was waiting for a loan from the bank to start the business. The loan didn't come on time, and he waited. He died on his birthday, 70th birthday, I think, in this small apartment, and never started the business. So my grandfather was also familiar with these stories, and I think that these types of stories cause a lot of anxiety in his mind. I'm going now to go through 3 cities or towns very quickly, both because I want to finish on time, but also I want those of you who want to read the book, I don't want to spoil too much for you, but 3 cities that I call in the book the cities of pain, because they were associated with a lot of pain. So the first one is Ham, which I just mentioned. And this, I went there with the son of that lawyer we just saw, Eric Samwelsdorf. This is Paul Otto Samwelsdorf, his son, who, by the way, was a linguist and a professor of linguistics at the University of Cologne. He spoke 15 languages, a very unique person. He just passed away a couple of years ago. But I visited Ham with him. 2 important things about Ham. One was, this is where I received that folder with the lawsuit against the German authorities claiming that those who expelled my grandfather from his country and his profession were responsible for his death. Another thing that I found in Ham, in the archive in Ham, relates to my uncle Rafi. It turns out that he also issued a German passport somewhere in the 50s. I don't remember exactly the year, but this obviously had to do with his job at the Mossad, where a German passport made it easier for him to navigate places. Another interesting story in Menden, Germany. Menden is where my grandfather grew up with his brother Ernst and with his sister Tante Lise. This is a fascinating story that you can write a whole book about that story alone. Their part of their family, Ernst and his family, fled Europe really at the last moment, all the way to Los Angeles. And the person in the middle there, his name is Martin, he's my mom's cousin. He came back to Germany as an American soldier, and his grandparents from his mother's side actually were in Theresienstadt, were released back to their home in Menden. Now, Menden was in a British zone. Martin, the American soldier, obviously was in the American zone. So he had to get special permit to cross from the American zone to the British zone. And General Dwight Eisenhower issued that permit personally after Martin's mom wrote him a letter. I want my son to visit his grandparents who were just released from Theresienstadt. An amazing story. I can talk about it later at Q&A, or you can read about it in the book. Probably the most painful city was the city or the town of Nordheim. And this is associated with my great-grandmother. This is Lucy's mother, who perished in the Holocaust. It's especially sad because in 1935, Netschen joined them in Tel Aviv. On the left, you see her on the ship that either brought her to Tel Aviv, that's why I wrote 1935 or 6. We never know if this is her picture on the ship going to Tel Aviv or coming back to Germany, because she left back to Germany. On the right there, you see a picture that was taken in Tel Aviv. And again, I don't know if it was taken exactly in 35 or in 36. And perhaps Netchen's face in this picture was touched so many times by a grieving hand that you cannot recognize her face in the photo, but this is definitely recognize part of their face and that dress, and I recognize Rafi and my grandmother, Lucy. I also went all the way to Riga, where Netchen was departed to. I also spoke to people who were on the same transport as she was. Left Hanover on December 15th, 1941. And I talked to two girls. Back then they were girls. When I talked to them, they were close to 90, I think, who were on that train. They didn't remember Netchen. She was 70 years old already, but they told me that some older people were shot immediately when they arrived in Riga. Another member of our family told us that she gave food to younger people, and so that she died of starvation. But Hugo and Lucy obviously did not go to Riga back then, and I rejoined them in Düsseldorf. And in Düsseldorf, they say in their letters that they went to Apollo Theater, which is well known in Düsseldorf, to see some jugglers and acrobats. And I want to read you a section from the book, just a paragraph where I talk about that because I think it's meaningful. So I went also to this acrobat show, although I'm not crazy about these types of shows. The traditional gong was heard and people started flying in the air as they now do in front of me. There is a moment in almost any acrobatic trick where the acrobat is not here nor not there. He releases his grip from one swing, hoping that the other swing will be waiting for him where he expects it. He jumps off the shoulder of one teammate, hoping to land on the shoulders of another. As they say in Yiddish, nicht dahin, nicht daher, neither here nor there. When my mom told me about the suicide, when I was almost 40, she told me that this is what this trip did to her father, Hugo. He never felt that he belonged in Israel, and this trip made it clear to him that he did not belong in Germany either. He was in midair, neither here nor there. From Düsseldorf, they left to Switzerland, to Zurich, and you could hear a sigh of relief in their letters because they were not happy in Germany overall. They kept talking about this. They were in Germany for about 2 months, and although they were kind of okay in Wiesbaden, they were not happy. And my grandmother wrote, "I was happy to leave Germany. It's impossible to start there again unless you have to be there or you are willing to assimilate." So that kind of makes me think that maybe there was some idea of maybe to move back, although I don't think so. And then suddenly she wrote another thing which was interesting. She wrote to my sister who just started first grade. She said, "Will you teach me Hebrew?" So, and that's something that is a theme in her letter. She's much more Israeli than Hugo was. She put here and there words in Hebrew. When she talks about Israel, she says, "Us Israelis," or "our beautiful Israeli kids who look much better than the German kids," as opposed to Hugo, who was more detached in his language. There was also the difference I talked about earlier, that in his letters, Hugo was very laconic versus my grandmother, who shared her emotion. Other differences that I gathered from interviewing relatives and people who knew them, Hugo was less flexible than Lucy. Lucy went with the flow. You know, she kind of, based on the circumstances, she adjusted. And Hugo had one idea of how things are supposed to be. And when things did not work the way he expected them, he did not adjust. Lucy was also much more sociable. She loved people. She had a lot of friends. So that kind of explains maybe some of the differences. And then they flew back to Israel and arrived in October. These are three pictures that I think tell a story. We had a tradition of during Purim, we lived in the suburb. Purim, we would go to the big city, Tel Aviv. It wasn't that big back then. And my grandmother would take us to the studio to take our pictures. On the left, you see a picture of 1956 Purim before they left. Then the picture in the middle is 1957. My sister, you notice, is by herself. I was not taken to this picture session. And I suspect that the reason is that the tension and anxiety at my grandmother's house, my grandparents' house, rose to such level that my mom decided to leave me with one of the neighbors. And in fact, 2 days after this picture was taken, this is when Hugo Mendel jumped to his death. In the picture on the right, it's in 1958, a year later, and things are kind of back to normal, although obviously they were not. My mother lost her husband just 3 years earlier, and then just lost her father, who committed suicide. And I think this is a good time to stop for a second and think what it means. I think this story illustrates that even survivors who managed to leave Europe very early, they left in 33, they suffered from uprooting, they suffered from feeling of guilt, because one thing that happens a lot of times when there is suicide in the family, people start blaming themselves, and that's something that my grandmother did. She also blamed herself for letting her mom go back to Germany, survivor's guilt. Why did I let her go back? And I think my mom suffered from the same thing. She felt guilty about her father. Maybe she felt guilty also about her grandmother, who visited them and then never was seen again. And they're definitely not unique in that sense. There are millions of stories like that of people who survived the Holocaust but still feel guilty about those who did not survive. So this is us, our little family around 1963. My mom down there, and I'm on the left, my sister on the right. As I said, my mom raised us as a single mother, and with the help of my grandmother. The word Hugo or Opa, which is grandfather in Germany, were not heard often in our house or in my grandmother's house. But as an undercurrent, there was a lot of sadness and bitterness that this is the way that my grandfather ended his life. The lawyer, Dr. Hugo Mendel, was so respected and ended his life this way. I think that the Eichmann trial made some difference in my mom's mind. And I want to tell you something about that. This is Fritz Bauer. Fritz Bauer was a Jewish district attorney of the state of Hessen in Germany. And he's the one who gave Israel the whereabouts of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. After my uncle Rafi died, I actually found out that Rafi was in charge of the contact with Fritz Bauer. So he was involved in not personally capturing Eichmann, but was involved in this whole saga of capturing Eichmann. This is a stamp that was issued in 2019 in honor of Fritz Bauer. And what it says on the stamp there is, nothing is a thing of the past. Everything is present and can become the future again, which is extremely relevant still in Germany and in other parts of the world. Nothing is a thing of the past, everything is present and can become future again. I'm showing this stamp for another reason. There is also a German version of my book, and in 2019, I flew to Germany to work with the translators, and we were talking about this paragraph where I'm talking about Fritz Bauer, and one of these guys from this group, we were talking about this in the morning. After lunch, he came back and gave me this stamp that he stood in line in the post office to buy this stamp that was just issued a couple of days ago. I thought that was a beautiful gesture, and I keep this stamp by my desk. Now, the Eichmann trial started in April of 1961. These are the three judges. All of them, by the way, were born in Germany. And so they were Yekes. They were much younger than Hugo's generation, so they spoke Hebrew and German. And there were lots of testimonies in the trial. Everybody in Israel was glued to their radio transistor and listened to the trial, even on the way to work and at work. And I think these testimonies communicated not only the horror of the Holocaust and the gas chambers and the ghettos, but also the complexity, and that there was more than one way to be a victim of the Holocaust. And one day, one testimony that I want to read you just a line from it was done by Benno Cohen, who in the 38, 39 was one of the leaders of the German community in Germany. So he stayed in Germany, and then I think he fled in 39. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, what he says about his experience there at the Jewish German community, he says, "We received the gloomy reports from all cities that a certain lawyer, a certain physician, and this industrialist or that big trader had committed suicide. They couldn't stand the pain they'd been caused as a result of losing their status and their honor. They didn't understand what happened and chose this way." So the suicide among German Jews was happening back then. And my mom was listening to this, and I think starting to realize that these people were victims of the Holocaust. And in a way, her father was a victim of the Holocaust as well. By then, she was working for a German Jewish lawyer who did take the exam and was working as a lawyer in Tel Aviv. This picture is from 1957, but we're actually now talking about the story after the Eichmann trial. And she convinced her mother and her boss to file a claim for the life of Dr. Hugo Mendel, who died because of the deportation, because of the uprooting. The file was, the claim was rejected, and then they decided to sue the German authorities with a claim that those who expelled him from his profession are responsible for his death. Now, this trial lasted 7 years, more than 7 years, so I'm not going to get into details. Also, I don't want to spoil the story, but I want to tell you one thing. And that's something that my mother didn't know about, and her boss, Dr. Lichtenstein, didn't know about, but I found out during my research. It turns out, remember the psychiatrist from Düsseldorf who was the head of the psychiatric clinic in Düsseldorf when they visited? It turned out that the German court assigned him as an expert witness in the case of Hugo Mendel, by coincidence. But the idea that the German court would assign a Nazi who sent people to their death in order to improve, quote unquote, the Aryan race, and then assign someone like this is just outrageous, obviously. And I wish I could go back in time and tell my mom and her boss about this. So they were just waiting for his expert opinion, which when it arrived, it wasn't surprising. He of course, said that there is no connection between the persecution in 1933 and the death or the suicide in 1957. His philosophy in general about psychiatry was that, you know, external stressors don't really affect people. I think that the trial was the closing of a circle for my mom. In 1922, when she was born, this was actually the first year that women were allowed to practice law in Germany. And her father had great hopes for her. You know, she was bright, and by age, when she was just 10, she could cite whole paragraphs from German law books. And of course, this never happened because of the deportation and because of the economic fall. But in a way, you know, she worked at a law firm for all of her adult life, and she worked a lot of times independently. But this particular lawsuit was very important to her to prove that they are responsible for his death. So some lessons from this book, and then we can have some questions. I think that going back to the quote from Fritz Bauer, that nothing is a thing of the past, everything is in the present and can become the future, I think is very relevant. There is a rise in anti-Semitism in many places in the world, also in Germany. And I think it's important to talk about it, that there are deadly consequences for those who are deported from countries, or the consequences can be deadly for those, even for those in Nazi times who fled early. And this is not only a Jewish thing, of course. There are millions of people displaced worldwide. You know, think about a Syrian refugee who maybe was a lawyer, maybe was an accountant in Syria, and now is in Germany somewhere or in other country, has to rebuild his life. There are also lessons to immigrants, I think. Being an immigrant myself, I think a lot about it. Or newcomers to any group, we have a choice. We can try to integrate as my grandmother did. Although she didn't speak the language, she really felt in her identity that she was an Israeli. And my grandfather did not. I don't mean to suggest in any way that one should leave one identity behind and totally transform. I think that one can belong to more than one group, and it's becoming easier and easier with technology today. I think the dangerous thing is not to belong at all, which is what happened to my grandfather. I think we also have some choices when it comes to friendships, which is relates to belonging and identity. And here too, you know, some people have a natural inclination not to be too friendly with people. But even those people, I think it's important for them to, you know, pick up the phone, have coffee with a friend, you reach out. And I wish my grandfather did more of that. I wish he talked to people also when he was so stressed. And I think, you know, for myself, I know that I have both Lucy and Hugo inside me. I mean, part of me really likes to be by myself, especially since I write. I like to be by my computer and type. But there is also Lucy in me. I love people. I love talking to people. I love to talk to people, and they listen to me. And in that sense, I want to thank you to release that you allowed me to release the Lucy in me in the past 40 minutes, and hopefully we can talk even more. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that incredible talk and for welcoming us into this history of your family. It was fascinating and deeply touching. It's my pleasure now to welcome any questions. We're a small enough group that I think if I put you in gallery and you put your hand up in some way, I can acknowledge you and welcome you to ask a question. I think some people are just processing. While people are thinking, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat for questions and hands up, Emmanuel, I teach Jewish studies, and one of my focuses is on gender and sexuality. And as I was listening to your story of your grandparents, I kept thinking about their differences and how much of that was kind of who they were as people, their life experiences, and how much of it was that we were talking about a man and a woman and the kind of the gendered expectations and norms. Have you ever reflected on those questions?
I don't talk about it in the book, but it's certainly something that was on my mind. I think that in some ways it was a little more difficult for Hugo in terms of being, it was expected of him to be the breadwinner, and maybe again, he had one picture of how life is. Remember, this is someone who was born at the end of the 19th century, so the role are clearly much more defined. Yeah, so I definitely think this was part of it. And part of it maybe just personality of some men are also very flexible or more flexible, but definitely the environment and the gender expectations, I think, played a role here.
What do you think people respond to most about this book? Why do you think people are finding it so deeply touching?
It's a very interesting question, because I think it really depends on the circle. There are people who really respond very strongly to the whole Yeke thing. So the Yekes.
Yeah.
I see on Facebook groups of Yekes, both in Israel, in Germany, and in here, that people connect to the language, to certain problems. But I think, the book was just released in March 22nd, I think, and it's just starting to spread. And there are people who also, early readers, who responded very much to the social justice element, because it is really relevant to what's happening today. There are so many refugees, so many people who migrate from one country to another willingly, but still face similar problems of how to adjust. And it's probably not going to change. In fact, we see more and more migration. So how people deal with migration in a fair way, and how the individual who finds himself or herself in a new country can possibly adjust, even if their personality is more similar to Hugo's personality, I think it will become an important issue.
I'm keeping an eye out for questions, but until you do, I have about a dozen. So I know you did a lot of research from this book. It's really quite evident. What did you want to research that you didn't find the data for, the evidence for?
Well, you have good questions. I mean, the thing I really regret, and I think we hear it so much from second generation people, is that I didn't ask my mom enough questions. By the time I was researching this book, this is very common. You hear it again and again. By the time I really was researching, my mom was no longer around. It's just the way things are, I guess. But I was able to talk to Martin, her cousin, and to Rafi, was still alive, and to all these people. But other than talking to people, I mean, in terms of reading, I think I read a lot of books from the period, and also had to translate that thick folder with all the legal issues. I'm definitely not familiar with all the legal little details, but I think talking to that generation would have been fantastic.
So I've got two questions I'm seeing in the chat. First from Mrs. Klein. If you wanted to unmute yourself.
I actually, having been one of those migrants who migrated from country to country under very different circumstances, I think I can tell you that clearly it's not not as much a gender related thing, but it is really very much the circumstances under which you migrate and the environment into which you migrate that will determine that adjustment. It's a very, and you know what motivates you to do it. If you feel that you're in a corner and have you no choice is one thing. If you choose, it is a very different thing. So, and it depends on, and I think, you know, Mr. Rosen's comment about the underlying temperament of the individual is a very strong driver about how people adjust or do not adjust to those changes.
Thank you. Susan, you had a question. You're muted.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you very much for the book. Kaylee sent it to me, and I read it not quite in one sitting, but almost. It was just kept me reading.
Thank you.
I was curious. Having a couple of years ago, I went to Poland, where my father's family was from, and doing that trip brought me a whole new extended family, actually. So I'm curious as to why you felt the need to so closely follow the actual path that your grandparents took in Germany. Not just to here and there or go to main places, but you actually felt the need to be on the same street, in the same hotel, the same meal practically. I thought that was really cute.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your words. And also, by the way, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but my father was from Poland. So there was, and I also went to Poland, but just one time I was invited to give a talk there. So of course I used the opportunity to go also to the town where he came from. And so there it was just going to understand where he came from. But in their case, I also pretty much, I tried to go on the same dates that they were there, like same season, because that really helped me understand what they saw, like the trees, what color were the trees, not only in terms of writing and describing it, but also in terms of what mood they were, and there is something pretty amazing about walking in the same place and then seeing, I remember that arriving in Düsseldorf on that walk when I kept hearing words in German that I don't understand their meaning. Also seeing the train station that did not change. And I had this postcard of that train station, and suddenly I see this place is actually there. It's hard to describe what it does exactly, but it really gets you into the story. And as you walk there, you kind of play in your mind, okay, now I'm Lucy, now I'm Hugo, what do I do, what do I think? And trying to get into their mind, I think it helps you write. And, you know, I never sat down with Lucy and talked with her about this. I mean, I loved her very much and we had so much fun together, but we didn't talk about it, except for one time she told me kind of the core idea that he had to sell the business. But it's not like we talked about that trip. Again, I wish I had, but I think that for writing the book, it was very helpful because then you really can get into the details of what they saw, the things that they did not describe maybe in their letters because they were not writing a book, they were just reporting to my mom.
Thank you.
One of the things that I was thinking as you were speaking is that I've heard so many grandchildren speak about their grandparents' stories and how there's an ability to engage those stories in a way that they find harder to do with their own parents. That there's something about skipping that generation that allows some sort of clarity about the story. Did you have that sense for yourself?
I think, first of all, I think you're right that it happens a lot of times. In my case, all the people involved were no longer with me when I wrote it. I mean, my mother, my father, my grandparents. So I don't think I had that issue as much. I think a lot of times it's harder to have a conversation with a person than to write about people who are once removed in time, and there maybe you yeah, I'm not sure if that is true, but in any case, in my case, I knew my mother very well, and I knew my grandmother very well, and I did not feel that it was easier for me to write about my grandmother. But I definitely think it's true in a lot of cases, especially when the parent is still alive, and also the relationship with the parent are different than with a grandmother who's always spoils you and is the most wonderful person always.
I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I have many more questions, but does anyone else have anything they'd like to ask? So I'm going to share one last question, which is, what didn't make it into the book that you wish you could have included?
I can
What
answer
sticks out in your mind?
The first part of your sentence is what didn't make it into the book. A lot. I mean, I actually wrote the first draft of this book in Hebrew in around 2003, and it's very thick. It had a lot of stories and details that I thought that eventually I wanted to clear everything so that the book is more accessible and people actually read it. And so I don't wish I had included those parts, but slowly I release, sometimes on Facebook, I write a little anecdote that I still have from that version of the story. Overall, I felt that I want to make sure that the book is accessible so that people read it. So I inserted some or amusing stories as well, although the book overall is not funny. Yeah, but I probably have 2 more books there that one day I'll write.
Wonderful. Well, I have to thank you for such a lovely evening and for welcoming us into this story. It's really been a delight. Thank you all for joining us tonight on this spring evening. And thank you also to Dr. Susan Landau-Chark, who found this book and said, we have to do this, and has really taken leadership on making this happen tonight. Thank you. And also to Michaela, who's been our tech support tonight and always is. So to all of you, may you have a good evening. Enjoy your dinner in California, Mr. Rosen, and I hope to see you all again soon.